couple months ago, Phyllis Zimbler-Miller, who's an author, playwright, podcaster of Never Again Is Now podcast, and Susan Chodakowitz, a Beth Jacob member. So a couple months ago, we had a couple of conversations. Let's do workshops to help educate members of our community to speak out. It was mainly, we were focused on anti-Semitism. And then, of course, with the last week and a half's developments, and it's a dark time for Israel, devastating blow to Israel, but our resolve is strong. The spirit of Israel and the IDF is phenomenal during these tough times. And so, of course, we just quickly adjusted and tweaked and redesigned the program to be focused on anti-Zionism and anti-Israel, which of course is the newest form of anti-Semitism. And so that's really a little bit of the background to how this event came to be. Phyllis Zimbler-Miller and Susan, strong, passionate activists for Israel. And I think we have a great opportunity tonight to have this session with an expert, a historian, filmmaker, Dr. Berenbaum, who our community knows very, very well. And so thank you all for being here. So important for us to know how to defend ourselves, how to speak up for Israel. And now it's a pleasure to pass it over to Phyllis. Thank you, Phyllis.
I'm Phyllis Zimbler-Miller. I co-host the podcast Never Again Is Now. It's on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. We've done over 100 episodes. Recently, we did one with Dr. Berenbaum and Rick Richmond about on day 3 of the war. But today, it's about what we all can do. And I want to thank Susan and Jacob Chodakowitz as the co-sponsor. And now, Dr. Berenbaum, who is the director of the Siggy Zarin Institute at American Jewish University, and an author of many, many books, and a scholar and an educator.
Let me begin by saying something very basic, which comes from a song that we sing all the time, Hine Matov Manaim Shevet Achim Gam Yachad. This is a time for Jews to be together. Together. It's a time for Jewish unity, and it's a time for Jewish strength. I want to tell you where I was last week, because that's going to set a context. Last week I was in Sobibor, in Belgium, in Auschwitz, Treblinka. I spent today at a conference sponsored by Variety on anti-Semitism, in which Jews in the entertainment industry were coming out, showing up in strength. And we had the whole question of what the nature of what Jews can do, should do, and also the circumstances that we face. Let me talk for 2 minutes on anti-Semitism, 2 minutes on Israel, and then we'll split. And I'll come back and respond to questions directly. I want us to understand something very basic about anti-Semitism. And it's very important that we understand it so we understand how to deal with it. Anti-Semitism differs as to its source: religious, political, social, economic, in the Nazi case, racial. Anti-Semitism differs as to its goal. If anti-Semitism is religious, the goal is conversion. If anti-Semitism is racial, the goal that we've seen in the Nazi universe was what they called extermination, what we have to refer to in non-Nazi speak as annihilation. If the goal is political, that can lead to expulsion. If the goal is political, that can also lead to the cry, Jews will not replace us. The goal is economic, it's a diminishment of economic power. If the goal is social, it means we don't want to see you after 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Some of you know that we have Hillcrest only because Jews were not admitted into other places. We have Cedars-Sinai because doctors could not find a place to practice and patients could not be taken. Anti-Semitism differs as to its priority. Is it number 1 priority, number 2 priority, number 3 priority, number 4? The best example that we have in the United States is that it's not been number 1. However bad we had it at any point in American history, other groups were in higher priority. And as I jokingly say, this is a race we don't want to win. Anti-Semitism also differs as to the stability of society. The axiom is the more stable a society, the more secure its Jews. Let me talk for 1 second because I left out the words of, in the case of Adolf Hitler, anti-Semitism was the highest priority from 1919 to 1945. His first words in the public sphere were anti-Semitic. His book told us what he wanted to do, and we'll come to whether somebody takes it seriously. And finally, the last words to his people was, above all, I enjoin you with regard to the Jews. Priority matters, priority counts, and stability is enormously important. And we're at a time of worldwide instability, including the instability in the United States of America. Again, let me summarize it so you understand, because we have to define what we're facing. Anti-Semitism differs as to its origin, its purpose. It differs as to its goal and target, what it wants to achieve. It differs as to its intensity and its priority. It differs as to the stability of society. And today we have a brand new tool that has never been available to everybody, but most particularly to those who hate because they have a passion for hatred, which is the megaphone of the internet and the social support systems of all of the social dynamics of the web. And that makes it not a local phenomenon, but a global phenomenon. Example is that I can give you 100 examples, but let me just tell one. Why did we have what happened at the Tree of Life Synagogue? Precisely because of the global communication stability. I hope this is clear. I want you to understand it. I think it's absolutely imperative because we have to distinguish the multiple forms. Let's go to Israel, and you'll forgive me because I'm going to be the bearer of bad news. Whatever you've seen may get worse. And that is Israel faces, folks, we have to be able to share with each other candidly. Israel faces the circumstances. If it goes in on the ground, there will be massive loss of life. If it doesn't go in on the ground, there will be something else, which is the loss of the deterrent factor. Israel's dealing with a government that does not enjoy the support of its population, which has expanded because of the government of national unity. And we have a unique situation today, which is the people are doing what the government should do, and the people are unified almost to a person. They are the ones who created the site for contact, the website for contact with the families who had people who were missing. They are the people who have been visiting in hospitals. They are the people who have been providing the resources, and they have provided their sons and their daughters for combat. If Israel goes in, there will be casualties, and there will be events that we have witnessed today with the misstatements regarding to the hospital. There will be civilian casualties on both sides. And the last element of it is if Israel does not go in, number one, the government itself will not be satisfying the anger of the people. And number two, the government itself has a problem because it has not been able to develop its own internal coherence to trust all of its resources for its use. What we witnessed was not the Holocaust. We witnessed something, in one sense, radically known in Jewish history, which is a pogrom. And that challenges the very basis of the meaning of the State of Israel. Because pogroms were supposed to be for Jewish people that didn't have the power to defend itself. And the raison d'etre of Israel has been that Jews must have the power to defend ourselves. It's not the Holocaust, in addition, because we are in a situation where we absolutely can overpower this enemy, not without cost, not without difficulty, not without loss of life. And we have a paradox, which is the weakness of Israel is its strength, and the strength of Israel is its weakness. The strength of Israel is its weakness, meaning in a world which favors the underdog, it looks like the powerful, the Goliath is picking on David. And the weakness of Israel is its strength, meaning Israel does not want to send its boys to die, its sons and its daughters to die. And it also doesn't want to kill unnecessarily, which in a battle is a battle of, it creates a weakness, and the weakness is compounded al achad kama v'kama, compounded many, many times more by the fact that they have hostages, and we don't want to lose the life of the hostages. From a military perspective, if you're merely dealing with a military perspective without values, you say the hostages are dead, and let's go to battle. If you value the preciousness of every human life, then you have to wrestle with the hostages, wrestle also with the fact that the hostages include Americans, including Frenchmen, including Germans, including, ironically, people from Thailand and people from the Philippines. And the question becomes what your responsibility is there. Last point before we begin. There's a book by an author, and I vehemently disagree with the book, but I'm swallowing my words to remind you of its title. The book is by Dara Horn, and the book is The World Loves Dead Jews. The world loves dead Jews. We don't want to be dead Jews. We are Jews with power. That's going to make us unpopular. It's going to make us impure. It's going to make us imperfect. And the world doesn't yet know, if at all, how to deal with what? With Jews with power. What's the good news in this? The first piece of good news is the response of the United States of America has been absolutely wonderful.
Right.
Absolutely wonderful. And no matter who you voted for in the last election, We have to express gratitude to Joe Biden, who feels this personally, who experiences this deeply, and who has made statements on behalf of the American people that are wondrous. We have to ensure that that remains the case. Not chas v'sholom because of Biden's bad wishes, but because there's not a combination of two factors, which is isolationists on the right and our problem on the fringes and the major elements of the left. Secondly, imagine the German Chancellor visited Israel. Imagine the French President visited Israel. And imagine the type of support that has been forthcoming with the blue and white stars on the Brandenburg Gate, the blue and white stars on the Empire State Building, the blue and white that you have in France, and this type of support. I don't know of a historical precedent for this. And if anybody's a better historian than I am, please come forth and tell me where there's a historical precedent. I don't know it. We're going to now know, and our task right now can be reflected in a basic way, Damala Shivla Bikuras. How do we deal with the challenges that are going to be set forth for Israel? And the challenges that are going to be set forth for us in the United States and for Jews throughout the world. And how do we do it when we know we're going to face problems in the immediate future? And they're going to be serious and deep. And what we have to do is, number one, we have to rely on each other. And we have to use the tools that we have available to have an impact. That's our goal this evening. I wish I could tell you better news, but I think I'm leveling with you. And that's the only thing I know how to do. Let me just add two things to that. One line you must remember is that Gaza is not occupied territory. And that Israel has left Gaza at tremendous upheaval. And if you want an emblem of that, James Wolfenson, who was the head of the World Bank at that point, raised tens of millions of dollars to preserve the greenhouses that were developed by the Israeli settlers, and they were a source of income and a source of fertility of the land, and they were immediately destroyed. So I just want you to keep that in mind, because that talks about the policy of a ruling group that doesn't look out for the well-being of its citizens. Let me add I'm going to come back and respond to these, but let me add a couple of pieces of complexity at this moment. Number one, and I'm going on what I'm surmising from seeing, Israel over a period of, and I want to say that this has been, Israel had followed a strategy of economic bribery of Hamas, and also a strategy of mowing the lawn periodically, meaning that you periodically needed a war to keep things calm. And the economic bribery included money from Qatar, and also a second thing was increasing the number of workers. One of the things that Israel discovered in the mapping of the different areas near Gaza was that some of these workers were essentially intelligence operatives for Hamas. So this policy is going to change significantly because they had very accurate and deep knowledge of where things were, exactly how to penetrate militarily the areas of weakness, and we'll deal with the rest of the question, but I want you to understand the complexity of precisely that. It's a failed policy. And one of the elements of the failed policy, essentially, some will say that the Prime Minister and the ruling government had made a decision that they would deal with Hamas and weaken the Palestinian Authority into a nullity, and consequently they thought they could handle Hamas, and they misjudged completely, and that's part of what they're grappling with at this moment. Let's also distinguish between patience and restraint. I want you to pay attention. One of the reasons President Biden went to Israel, which is fairly clear, is to ask a really deep and profound question. Blinken asked it, Austin asked it, and President Biden asked it, which is what are you going to do the day after? And by the way, when I say that, you have to understand that there's a major difference between tactics and strategy. And the question becomes, we understand what the tactics may be. What is the strategy? What is to be achieved? And let me also say that a couple of mistakes have been made there, which is that you cannot draw red lines unless you know how you're going to accomplish those red lines. And that is that if you're going to remove Hamas if you're saying you're going to remove Hamas from power, you have to remove Hamas from power, and you have to know how you're going to remove Hamas from power, and you have to ask the next question is, what do you do the day after? And by the way, America should be deeply experienced in asking these questions, because what was our catastrophe in both Iraq and Afghanistan, if not asking the question? The easiest part of our issue in Iraq was to get rid of Saddam Hussein. The question becomes, and then? So that's a little bit of the game that's being played politically. And by the way, those are serious questions coming from the President and Austin and Blinken. The question becomes, what happens the day after? And the other question becomes, if you draw a red line, you have to be able to achieve it, and that's the tension at this moment. And that Israel also calls that the deterrence factor. And the deterrence factor is enormously important because Israel faces an additional enemy, which is Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has more rockets than Gaza. The only good news about Gaza is Gaza is expending its rockets at such a ratio that if the intelligence is correct, and that's a capital if, then they don't have that many left. There was a wonderful article in Atlantic, which you don't have to remember anything else about it, but all it suggested was Harvard students for pogroms. The headline was Harvard students for pogroms. In other words, what you're accepting in this, you're accepting pogroms as a natural, normal reality, and it used ridicule as a means of piercing moral pretense. And I want to suggest that that's a very important tactic as a way of piercing moral pretense. And I thank you, because that's a brilliant response. I thank your group. Nobody Nobody should accept the murder of men, women, and children, the kidnapping of innocent civilians, the raping of women, and the beheading of children. I mean, justified? Well, let me suggest a couple things. Historically, prior to 1948, the Jews living in Palestine were called Palestinians. The Arabs living in Palestine were Arabs. It's a historical point. If you look at, I'll give you a technical thing, that is, my brother-in-law's original passport, place of birth was Palestine. And I always say, I'm a historian, so I'm painting, I won't say the word here, but painting posterior historian. So when I speak about Palestine prior to 1948, I'm speaking in a very particular way. Jews wanted to get, you can say, the land of Israel, but they were using the language they were using was Palestine. But there is no winning argument as to whether Palestinians were an entity or not, because at this point in time there is a defined identity. There's a defined Israeli identity and a defined Palestinian identity, and even if you want to write about it historically, you're not going to win the argument. So I wouldn't advance it. It's just not a winning argument and not a compelling argument. And identity, remember, shifts in a variety of ways. We used to have Negroes, we used to have blacks, and now we have a conversation about African Americans. We also had a long debate whether we are Jewish Americans or American Jews. And now a variety of different people with that identity is a moving target, as it were. Okay. Let me go through these, let me tell you what our agenda is. I'm going to go through these questions fairly rapidly now. I'm going to say a couple of more things, and then I want to, in keeping with the councilwoman's instructions, I want to give you and by the way, anybody who grapples, and Liebe will attest to this, anybody who grapples with the Holocaust doesn't have easy ways of providing hope. But let me try to do that. I want to go backwards. How do you respond to people who say anti-Zionist and anti-Israel actions are not anti-Jewish? Let's go with the easiest way to remember, and remember this clearly. This is the element of Natan Sharansky. What is the difference between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism? Sharansky said it is 3 Ds. Double standards, delegitimation, demonization. If you judge the whole world by one standard and Israel by another, then what you have is you're bordering on, you're coming close to, you may be engaging with anti-Semitism. Interesting example, some of you will find it on the web. Take a look at what happened in the encounter between Naftali Bennett and a BBC correspondent. BBC correspondent said, boom, boom, boom. And Naftali Bennett ultimately lost his cool, which is fine. And he said, it's very interesting, when the British bombed Dresden, after the bombing of London, somehow they didn't take into consideration civilian casualties. Double standards. We in the United States did not engage with a tremendous amount of restraint in terms of our bombing in Vietnam, our bombing in Iraq, our bombing in Afghanistan. The question becomes, and I presume we're the good guys. So the question is double standards. The second is the question of delegitimization. Delegitimization says, I will concede that Israel was created on land that was inhabited, not solely inhabited by Arabs. Historical fact. So was the United States. So was Canada. So was Australia. So were about 29 different countries. And the question is, does that mean Israel does not have the right to exist? We are not contemplating returning the United States to the Native Americans. We had an issue, ironically, that the Supreme Court, and it's a very interesting issue, in which the Supreme Court went like this to figure out a way not to give 50% of Oklahoma back to Oklahoma. And the one justice on this, ironically, who's a specialist in Native American law is Samuel Alito, who voted to return 50% of Oklahoma to the Native American population because he found that that was what the law said. The governor of Oklahoma is not saying we can't exercise our law, etc., etc. So that's the question of delegitimization. The third is demonization. Israel is the source of all evil. We are harvesting, why do we kill Palestinians? Because we harvest their organs for transplants. That is the new iteration of the blood libel. That's the new iteration of the protocols of the elders of Zion. And the question becomes, are we the source of demonism in the world? And again, the response to that is that's the moment in which it is anti-Semitism. The last answer to that is something else. If you're a Jewish historian, and if you believe that the Jewish people have made an existential decision, Jewish people have decided that the future of the Jewish people is inextricably linked to the state of Israel. It will soon be a majority of the Jewish people, and that essentially means that when you're arguing against the existence of the state of Israel, then you're essentially arguing against the future that the Jewish people have decided for themselves. If that's not anti-Semitism, let's figure that out. But the Jewish people have essentially made, look, I'm going to go back theologically. I can argue that the most important date in the Jewish calendar is the 10th of Av. And I can argue that, including standing against a rabbi as a historian, he might say the most important date in the Jewish calendar is the 6th of Sivan, when we receive the Torah. But historically, the most important date for us is the 10th of Av. How do we respond in the aftermath of defeat? In the aftermath of defeat, we once responded by going into exile in Babylonia, planting crops, having children, getting married, having children, and thinking of returning to Jerusalem. We responded to the defeat of the year 70 with Yavne and Chachamah, Yavne and its wise men, and a portable religion. Portable religion is anywhere a Sefer Torah and a minyan is available. That's where sacredness takes place. And we responded to 1945 by recreating the Jewish state. Opposition to that is opposition to the future of Jewish history. Not to negate us, but that's what the Jewish people have decided. How do you respond to those who say, why don't the Israelis solve the situation by giving the Palestinians their own land, including the Gaza Strip? Let's go, let me give you a slogan. Look, I'm in favor of a two-state solution, because I don't see any alternative. I know that may be unpopular, but I can tell you I'm in favor of it. The problem is that the Palestinians now are incapable. You can't turn it over to the Palestinian Authority. It's corrupt, it's decadent, and it has no image. It has a president who's 87 years old and not willing to take any risks for peace. You just saw what happened in Gaza. Who's going to turn over an independent state to Hamas? More importantly, we could now be in the 23rd year of an independent Palestinian state. 95% of the land was offered in 2020, in the waning days of Bill Clinton's administration. Arafat had the possibility of making a decision to establish an independent Palestinian state, and he decided on the Intifada #2. The same possibility existed later on during the government of Ehud Olmert. And that possibility, Abba Eban put it cutely, and nobody ever marshaled the English language in support of Israel better than Abba Eban. He said the Palestinians have never lost an opportunity to lose an opportunity. So I tell you, as a person who is in favor of a two-state solution, there are no conceivable circumstances in which I could argue that one should go for a two-state solution at this moment in time. Why am I for a two-state solution? Because I believe demographically you cannot have a Jewish democratic state and absorb the Palestinian population. How you resolve that at this point with that leadership is impossible. And if you look at it, there was one leader of the Palestinian people who was building a state, a prime minister by the name of Fayyad, and he was thrown out. And everybody who worked with him, all of the Americans, all of the Israelis, said this is a man who is interested in building a Palestinian state, the infrastructure for a Palestinian state. And he was cast aside all the way through. How would you respond by saying that Israel deserves what happened because Zionists kicked the Palestinians out and stole the land? Best answer we got, nobody deserves what happened. And we now know that the Harvard students are Harvard students for pogroms. And if you believe that they have the moral high ground, then they have to justify the beheading of infants. And I don't know about you, but nothing morally justifies the beheading of infants. How would you respond to people saying Israel should exercise restraint? Several things. Number one, Israel does exercise restraint. Number two, I don't know any other people who would exercise restraint at this moment in time. And precisely, this was designed essentially to attack Israel, to wound Israel, to maim Israel, to violate everything there. And now you talk about restraint? Now Israel will have to have a great struggle in the coming days, and we're going to hear an awful lot about it. You just heard a brief element here, and let's go through the technicalities. The United States now has backed Israel 100% with demonstrable physical proof that the attack on the hospital, first of all, wasn't an attack on the hospital, it was an attack on the parking lot adjacent to the hospital. Secondly, there was a rocket that went up that immediately came down, and the fuel was that which caused the fire. And there is no reliable information that 500 people were killed. And the Arabs lost the opportunity to meet with Joe Biden in Jordan, King of Jordan, the president of Egypt, and the president of the Palestinian Authority, which would have required for them to open a corridor for the arrival of relief and water and etc. and electricity and food to the Palestinian population. And this, some people have said, is the first time that somebody has refused to meet with the President of the United States. So they got caught up in their own propaganda. And what is the result? The result, and remember, Israel controls one of the entrances to the Gaza Strip. The Egyptians control the other entrance to the Gaza Strip. And the most they're talking about at this moment, and we believe we have an approval for 20 trucks. 20 trucks for 2 million people. And what more restraint do you want than Israel warning the people of northern Gaza to move to southern Gaza, permitting food and other supplies to come into southern Gaza? If that's not restraint, what is restraint? How would you respond to people saying that the current attack is due to Israel creating an open-air prison in Gaza and economically strangling people in the land? That, first of all, I didn't hear the word Egypt. Egypt doesn't want Hamas in Egypt because it's allied with the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the enemy of Egypt, of the government of Egypt. Now, Gaza, are conditions in Gaza good? They're horrific. They're horrific. The resources that could have been used to build schools, to create the economy, etc., are going to military purposes. And again, one cannot imagine that these are people that the Hamas has the ability to defeat Israel. It merely has the ability to commit cruelty to Israel, and let's state it correctly. Hamas is a religious body with an ideological commitment. Its charter calls for the eradication of Israel. And I don't know any other state that wants to permit its own eradication. You just don't permit its eradication. Are conditions in Gaza good? No. Who is responsible? The first responsibility, first of all, it's a dual responsibility on its borders. Secondly, the responsibility is the governing body, which has the opportunity to achieve something else. How would you respond to people who say the current violence is Israel's fault and being perpetrated by freedom fighters? Let me just say one more thing about Hamas's charter. And I probably shouldn't say this in a synagogue, but I'm going to say it anyhow. Jews should trust threats more than promises. Jews should trust threats more than promises. In Jewish history, the enemies of the Jewish people who have made threats meant it. And the only thing that inhibited them from achieving their threats was they didn't have the capacity to realize it. People have made many promises to the Jewish people, and many have not been realized. Hitler said in 1925 exactly what he wanted to do to the Jewish people, and people said once in power he would moderate. The majesty of office would force him to the center. I can document for you, some people voted for Hitler because he was an anti-Semite, more voted for him despite the fact that he was an anti-Semite, because they could achieve their agenda with him. He said what he was going to do, and you know what? He attempted to do it, etc. How would you respond to those say that Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people in Gaza? Alavai. Would that it were the case. We have to say that because the problem is, in the aftermath of this, there needs to be a strategy as to what is to be achieved. Now, one of the strategies of what is to be achieved is that one of the Arab states will come in and accept responsibility, an Arab state that is willing to live alongside Israel, and then we can invest in the Hilton on the beaches of Gaza. It's a beautiful beach. It could be a very successful, it could be the Riviera of the Middle East. But remember, we need, and I can tell you that I don't believe we're thinking about that, and we have to create the lie that Hamas does not, because you can't get rid of 2 million people. You can't get rid of 2 million people, so you have to figure out what's going to happen in its aftermath. That was a conversation that I believe that the President of the United States had with Israeli leadership. And frankly, I don't believe Israeli leadership has been thinking of that. I've known Benjamin Netanyahu since high school. And I can tell you he's a brilliant tactician. I don't know what his strategy is. How would you respond to people who are joining protests to free Palestine? Again, the answer to that is Alavai. If Palestine was possible to have a leadership that was interested in freedom, they could have had it 23 years ago, they could have had it 2008 versus 23, 15 years ago. They could have had it in 1937, they could have had it in 1948. I believe ultimately Israel has to find a way to retain itself as Jewish and democratic and deal with this population. And the only way I know is Alavai, that Palestine could be free but peaceful and humane and decent. But tell me anybody of any fair mind who can say that that's achievable today. Okay, Jewish people is now called upon to be united. Remember, I said this was not the Holocaust, and the most basic reason is because we have powers that we did not have.